Oświęcim, Poland, January 1945. Fires burn across the camp complex, but not in the crematoria where over 1 million people had been murdered. The gas chambers lie silent, blown apart by SS engineers in a desperate attempt to hide the evidence. Instead, flames consume warehouses filled with the possessions of the dead, suitcases and shoes and children's clothing, set ablaze by retreating guards who know the Red Army is only days away. When Soviet soldiers finally reach the gates on 27th January 1945, they find not the efficient killing machine that had operated for years, but its ruins and the skeletal survivors the Nazis had abandoned to die. The question that would haunt Europe for decades had only begun. What do you do with the largest murder site in human history? The story of Auschwitz-Birkenau after liberation is not simply one of remembrance, it is a story of investigation and trial, of political manipulation and genuine grief, of local necessity and international obligation. The site that had witnessed industrial-scale murder would become, over 8 decades, the most visited memorial to genocide in the world. But that transformation was neither inevitable nor uncomplicated. It required survivors to fight for recognition, governments to grapple with uncomfortable truths, and the international community to decide what this place should mean for future generations. The camp complex the Soviets discovered in January 1945 was vast. Auschwitz was not a single location, but a network of over 40 camps spread across the region. The main camp, Auschwitz III, had been established in 1940 in converted Polish army barracks. Auschwitz-Birkenau, built in late 1941, became the primary extermination center with its 4 large gas chamber and crematorium complexes. Auschwitz III Monowitz served the IG Farben chemical works, and dozens of subcamps provided slave labor for German industry. At its peak, in August 1944, the complex held over 135,000 prisoners. Between 1940 and 1945, approximately 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz. Of these, at least 1.1 million were murdered, the vast majority of them Jews transported from across Nazi-occupied Europe. From Hungary alone, over 430,000 Jews arrived in the spring and summer of 1944, most sent directly from the trains to the gas chambers without ever being registered as prisoners. Polish political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma and others also perished in enormous numbers. The scale of killing at Birkenau, where at peak capacity the gas chambers and crematoria could murder and dispose of up to 6,000 people per day, was unmatched anywhere in the Nazi system. By January 1945, however, the machinery of death had been dismantled. As Soviet forces advanced westward during the Vistula-Oder offensive, SS commanders received orders to evacuate the camps and destroy evidence of mass murder. Beginning on 17th of January, nearly 60,000 prisoners were forced onto death marches westward, trudging through snow toward concentration camps deeper in Germany. Those who stumbled or could not keep pace were shot. Thousands died of exhaustion, cold, and summary execution along the routes to camps like Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Mauthausen. The SS worked systematically to conceal what had happened. Crematoria 2 and 3 at Birkenau were partially dismantled, their machinery shipped into the Reich. On 23rd January 1945, engineers detonated charges that reduced them to rubble. 3 days later, SS men set fire to the warehouses the prisoners called Canada, storehouses crammed with the possessions of the murdered. Retreating soldiers and even Wehrmacht troops passing through helped themselves to what remained. On 26 January, just hours before liberation, the last crematorium, Crematorium 5, was blown up. The SS had planned to dynamite everything, to erase the camp from the earth. They ran out of time. When soldiers of the 60th Army of the 1st Ukrainian Front reached Oświęcim on the morning of 27th January 1945, they encountered Monowitz first, on the eastern outskirts of the town. Approximately 800 sick and dying prisoners had been left behind there. That afternoon, around 3:00 p.m., Soviet troops entered Auschwitz III and Birkenau, meeting scattered German resistance near the main camp. Fighting continued for hours. Over 230 Red Army soldiers died in the liberation of the camp and the surrounding area, including Colonel Seaman Lvovich Bezprozvany, commander of the 472nd Infantry Regiment. What the soldiers found shocked even men hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. General Vasily Petrenko, commander of the 107th Infantry Division, later recalled that despite seeing death every day, he was stunned by what the Nazis had done to the inmates. They found approximately 7,000 prisoners still alive, most barely so. The majority were middle-aged adults or children under 15, those deemed too weak for the death march. 600. Corpses lay unburied. In the warehouses that had not been destroyed, Soviet investigators documented 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 articles of women's clothing, and 7 tons of human hair, shaved from victims before or after their murder, packaged for shipment to German factories. The liberation of Auschwitz was not a planned military objective. Soviet commanders had heard of the camp through intelligence channels, and Stalin himself had received reports from Allied leaders about its existence. But Auschwitz held no strategic value. The Red Army encountered it simply as a consequence of their advance across Poland. They had liberated Majdanek, another major concentration and extermination camp, the previous July, and in the months that followed would discover many more camps as the Reich collapsed. Yet Auschwitz, by its sheer scale, was different. For most survivors, liberation was not a definable moment of joy. They were too ill, too starved, too traumatized. Many did not realize at first that the men in Soviet uniforms represented salvation rather than another form of danger. The liberating forces, assisted by the Polish Red Cross, immediately organized medical care. Red Army hospitals cared for approximately 4,500 survivors in the weeks following liberation. As late as June 1945, some 300 former prisoners remained at the camp because they were still too weak to be moved. Many survivors would never fully recover from the physical and psychological damage inflicted during their imprisonment. Within days of liberation, Soviet authorities began investigating the crimes committed at Auschwitz. The Extraordinary Soviet State Commission for the Investigation of the Crimes of the German fascist aggressors sent forensic teams led by SMERSH, Soviet military counterintelligence, into the camp. They photographed the ruins, mapped the layout of the facilities, and gathered fragments of documents that had survived the fires. They conducted autopsies, opened mass graves, and interviewed survivors who could still speak. Soviet forensic specialists recovered dental remains they believed belonged to Adolf Hitler's victims, though they kept their findings about Hitler's suicide secret for decades. The Soviet investigation produced valuable documentation, but it also served propaganda purposes. In early newspaper reports, including articles in Pravda, Soviet writers often failed to mention Jews specifically as victims, instead referring broadly to citizens of the Soviet Union and other countries. This reflected Stalin's policy of suppressing Jewish identity within the broader narrative of Soviet suffering. The emphasis was placed on the defeat of fascism, rather than on the specific targeting of Jews for extermination. This pattern of obscuring the Jewish character of the Holocaust would persist in Soviet and Eastern Bloc accounts for decades. Polish authorities conducted their own investigations in 1945 and 1946, gathering evidence for war crimes trials. The most significant of these was the trial of Rudolf Höss, the longest-serving commandant of Auschwitz, who had overseen the camp from May 1940 through November 1943 and returned briefly in 1944 to supervise the murder of Hungarian Jews. Höss had escaped capture at war's end and lived under a false identity until March 1946, when British investigators tracked him to a farm in northern Germany. After interrogation and testimony at the Nuremberg trials, where he served as a witness, Höss was extradited to Poland. His trial before the Polish Supreme National Tribunal began in Warsaw on 11 March 1947. For nearly 3 weeks, witnesses provided harrowing testimony of gassings, torture, and systematic cruelty. But the most chilling witness was Höss himself. In the packed courtroom, he described with clinical precision the extermination process he had developed, displaying what observers noted was a technician's pride in efficiency. He estimated that at least 2.5 million people had been gassed at Auschwitz, though he later revised this figure downward. Modern historians place the total number of dead at approximately 1.1 million. On 2nd April 1947, the court sentenced Höss to death. Former prisoners petitioned for the execution to take place at Auschwitz itself, writing that a man who had committed such murders should die where his victims had died. The authorities agreed. On the morning of 16th April 1947, Höss walked under armed escort to a wooden gallows constructed specifically for him, erected near the crematorium of Auschwitz the Föhn, just yards from the villa where he had lived with his wife and 5 children while overseeing mass murder. Approximately 100 witnesses watched, including former prisoners and Polish government officials. He spoke no final words. His body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location. The execution of Rudolf Höss was the most prominent of several trials of Auschwitz personnel. A second major trial, known as the Auschwitz Garrison Trial, took place from November to December 1947. 40 former SS personnel stood accused, including Arthur Lieber-Henschel, the second commandant. 23 received death sentences, and others were imprisoned for terms ranging from 3 years to life. Over the following decades, additional trials would be held in Poland, Germany, and elsewhere. Yet of the roughly 7,000 SS men and women who served at Auschwitz and survived the war, only a small fraction ever faced justice. Many simply melted back into German and Austrian society, their wartime service unknown to neighbours and sometimes even to their own families. Even as trials were underway, a different process had begun at the camp itself. The question of what to do with Auschwitz arose almost immediately after liberation. Unlike most concentration camps, which were quickly dismantled or repurposed, Auschwitz presented a unique challenge: the sheer scale of the crime and the largely intact nature of Auschwitz. Despite the destruction at Birkenau, meant that the site could serve as evidence and memorial in ways that other camps could not. The impulse to preserve came first from survivors themselves. Before the end of 1945, officials at the highest levels of the Polish government had taken steps to transform the former camp into a museum. On 1 May 1945, the Provisional Government gave the Ministry of Culture and Art authority over parts of the concentration camp connected with the direct extermination of millions of people. The ministry received instructions to secure the site and prepare a concept for a future museum. The driving force behind these efforts was a group of former prisoners. On 31 December 1945, members of the National People's Council, who had themselves been imprisoned at Auschwitz, tabled a legislative initiative calling for the creation of a memorial site. They were led by Alfred Fidakiewicz, and their proposal called for Oświęcim and Brzezinka to be designated as a place to commemorate Polish and international martyrdom. In April 1946, the Ministry of Culture and Art sent a team of former prisoners to Oświęcim to protect the site and begin organising a museum. The group was led by Tadeusz Wąsowicz, who would become the first director. These men had no training in museum work or historic preservation. They had only their own experiences of the camp and a determination that what had happened there should never be forgotten. Many of the structures in Auschwitz were still in relatively good condition. At Birkenau, the brick blocks, guard towers, main gate, and some wooden barracks survived. The warehouses in the expansion area still contained vast quantities of victims' possessions that had not been burned. Wąsowicz's team worked to collect and secure material evidence, sending documents to the District Commission for the investigation of German crimes in Krakow, while preparing an exhibition for visitors. The formal opening of the museum took place on 14th June 1947, the 7th anniversary of the arrival of the first transport of Polish political prisoners. Tens of thousands of people attended, mostly former prisoners, their relatives, and delegations from Polish and Jewish community organizations. The ceremony began with religious services, Catholic in the courtyard of Block 11, Jewish in Block 4, and Eastern Orthodox and Lutheran services inside Block 11. Polish Premier Józef Cyrankiewicz, himself a former Auschwitz prisoner, addressed the crowd, as did representatives of the Central Committee of Jews in Poland. Participants placed wreaths at the death wall in the courtyard of Block 11, and Cyrankiewicz declared the museum open. The Polish Parliament formally established the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum on 2nd July 1947. The legislation stated that the grounds of the former Nazi concentration camp, together with all buildings and equipment, shall be preserved for all time as a monument to the martyrdom of the Polish nation and other peoples. This language itself reflected the political reality of post-war Poland. Under Soviet influence, the communist government emphasized Polish suffering and resistance while downplaying the specifically Jewish character of the Holocaust. The museum's early exhibitions focused on Polish political prisoners and the anti-fascist struggle. treating Jews as one category among many victims rather than as the primary targets of Nazi extermination. This approach would persist for decades and generate considerable controversy. In the early years, some of the camp's structures were lost to local need. Members of the local population, facing tremendous deprivation in the immediate post-war period, dismantled some barracks for firewood and building materials. While historians lament the loss, it was understandable given the desperate circumstances. The wooden barracks of Birkenau, built hastily by prisoners using poor materials, were particularly vulnerable. Many deteriorated or were taken apart. The brick buildings of Auschwitz fared better, and the museum concentrated its early efforts there. By the late 1950s, the boundaries of the museum were still being defined, and former property owners on the land were being formally dispossessed and compensated. Work began on securing the ruins at Birkenau, including the remains of the crematoria and gas chambers. A small monument to the martyrdom of the Jews was unveiled in 1948, and another small monument to the victims of the camp appeared in 1955. But the major international recognition would take longer. In the 1960s, the museum underwent significant expansion and internationalization. Beginning in 1960, so-called national exhibitions opened in individual blocks of Auschwitz III. Countries whose citizens had been deported to the camp were invited to create their own displays. The Soviet Union opened its exhibition in 1961, followed by others from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Yugoslavia. These national pavilions presented the history of persecution and deportation from each country's perspective, though they reflected the political priorities of their respective governments. The Austrian exhibition, for example, opened in 1978, presenting Austria primarily as a victim of National Socialism, a framing that critics would later challenge as historically incomplete. The most significant addition to the memorial came in April 1967 with the unveiling of the International Monument to the Victims of Fascism at Birkenau. The monument, designed by Italian architects Pietro and Andrea Castella in collaboration with Polish and Italian artists, had been nearly a decade in the making. An international competition was announced in 1957, but the selection and construction process stretched across years of debate and revision. The monument lies at the western end of the railway lines that cross Birkenau from the main gate near the ruins of the crematoria. It consists of piled stone blocks stretching approximately 100 meters, dominated by a higher block bearing an inverted triangle resembling the badges worn by camp prisoners. Approximately 200,000 people attended the unveiling ceremony on 16 April 1967, 20 years to the day after Rudolf Höss's execution. Polish state officials, prisoners' organizations from many countries, the Israeli welfare minister, and numerous ambassadors and journalists were present. 23 bronze plaques bearing the same inscription in different languages were set into the cobblestone platform before the monument. The dedication referred to the victims of fascism, language that some critics noted continued to obscure the specifically Jewish character of the genocide. The monument, like the museum itself, reflected the political constraints of Cold War Poland, where communist ideology emphasized anti-fascist solidarity over Jewish particularity. In 1979, Auschwitz-Birkenau achieved international recognition when it was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Poland's initiative to have the site listed succeeded, though UNESCO stipulated that it would be the only concentration camp on the list, serving as a symbol for all similar sites. The original entry was titled simply Auschwitz Concentration Camp. The UNESCO designation brought financial and technical assistance for preservation and signaled the site's importance to global heritage, yet it also invited renewed scrutiny of how the camp's history was being presented. The end of communist rule in Poland in 1989 opened a new chapter in the memorial's history. With Soviet influence removed, scholars and educators gained freedom to re-examine how the Holocaust was commemorated at Auschwitz. Two developments converged to reshape the site's meaning. First, the genocide of European Jews became a more prominent subject of public debate in Poland and across Europe. Second, survivors and international Jewish organizations pressed for greater recognition of Jewish victims at a site where 90% of those murdered had been Jews. In 1994, a new text was engraved on the International Monument at Birkenau, explicitly acknowledging that the majority of victims were Jews. The original plaques had referenced 4 million dead, a figure based on Soviet-era estimates derived from the theoretical capacity of the crematoria. Historians had long known this number was inflated. The new inscription, based on more rigorous research, stated that about 1.5 million men, women and children, mainly Jews from various countries of Europe, had been murdered. This revision, while historically accurate, was painful for some who felt it diminished the scale of the crime. Yet it represented a commitment to historical truth over political convenience. The museum itself underwent significant changes in the post-communist era. The International Auschwitz Council was created to oversee the site's development. Collaboration with Yad Vashem, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Authority, brought new resources and perspectives. National exhibitions were gradually updated to reflect current historical understanding. The Soviet exhibition, unchanged since 1985, was eventually closed due to disputes over how to address the territorial situation of the USSR between 1939 and 1941, including the annexation of the Baltic states and eastern Poland. In 2005, the museum opened the International Center for Education about Auschwitz and the Holocaust, dedicated to developing educational programs based on the history and human experiences of the camp. The center conducts seminars, study visits, and teacher training, serving tens of thousands of participants annually. Online education expanded significantly, including web-based lessons and a podcast series. The museum also became active on social media, reaching millions of people worldwide with content designed to combat Holocaust denial and promote historical understanding. Preservation of the physical site presented enormous challenges. The remains of Auschwitz-Birkenau cover nearly 200 hectares, comprising over 150 buildings and approximately 300 ruins, including the remains of the gas chambers and crematoria that the SS attempted to destroy. The wooden barracks of Birkenau, built hastily with poor materials by starving prisoners, required constant maintenance. The brick structures of Auschwitz needed ongoing restoration. The collections, including 100,000 personal objects belonging to victims, required specialized conservation in modern laboratories. In 2009, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation was established to create a perpetual fund for the site's long-term preservation. The goal was to build an endowment sufficient to maintain the memorial in perpetuity, ensuring that future generations would be able to see the authentic remains. Nearly 40 governments, numerous cities and private donors have contributed. Germany, whose Nazi government built and operated the camp, has been a major contributor. The foundation has enabled multi-year conservation programs addressing everything from deteriorating roofs to fragile documents. By the 2020s, Auschwitz had become the most visited memorial to the Holocaust in the world. In 2019, before the global pandemic disrupted travel, more than 2.3 million people visited the site. Attendance fell sharply during COVID-19 restrictions, but recovered to 1.68 million in 2023 and approximately 1.83 million in 2024. Visitors come from around the world, with the largest numbers from Poland, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, and Germany. The museum employs nearly 300 educators who guide visitors in nearly 20 languages. In 2007, UNESCO approved a Polish and Israeli request to change the site's official name. The original designation, Auschwitz concentration camp, became Auschwitz-Birkenau, German Nazi concentration and extermination camp, 1940-1945. The new name emphasized both the German responsibility for the site and its dual function as both concentration and extermination camp. It also responded to concerns about the increasingly common misuse of phrases like Polish death camp in foreign media, language that falsely suggested Polish complicity in what was entirely a German Nazi operation conducted on occupied Polish territory. The passing of time has brought new urgency to the museum's educational mission. The survivors who could provide first-hand testimony are aging. By the time of the 80th anniversary of liberation in January 2025, only a few dozen survivors remained, the youngest of the 7,000 who had been liberated. The museum has worked extensively to record their testimonies, collaborating with organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation to preserve oral histories for future generations. Interactive educational programs use these testimonies alongside historical documents and physical remains to engage new audiences. The site continues to evolve. New exhibitions have opened in recent years, including updated national pavilions and expanded coverage of victim experiences. In 2024, the museum reported significant progress on a new main exhibition focused on the experiences of Auschwitz prisoners. Conservation work continues across the site. The sauna building at Birkenau, where new arrivals were processed, has been restored and opened to visitors. Block 17, which once housed the Yugoslav exhibition, is being renovated for a new joint exhibition by the successor states of the former Yugoslavia. Auschwitz today serves multiple functions simultaneously. It is a cemetery, the final resting place of over 1 million people whose ashes lie in the soil and ponds of Birkenau. It is a crime scene preserved as evidence of genocide. It is a museum with exhibitions, collections, archives, and educational programs. It is a research centre where historians continue to investigate the history of the camp and the fate of its victims. And it is a warning, a place where visitors confront the consequences of hatred, racism, and the dehumanization of others. The word Auschwitz has become more than the name of a place. It has become a symbol, a warning, and a synonym for the collapse of human values under ideologies of hatred. As survivors pass from the world, the authenticity of the physical site becomes ever more important. The barbed wire and guard towers, the barracks and railroad tracks, the ruins of the gas chambers and the piles of victims' possessions, these tangible remains speak with a power that no book or film can fully replicate. The international community's engagement with Auschwitz has deepened over recent decades. In 1996, Germany designated 20th January, the anniversary of liberation, as the official day for commemoration of the victims of National Socialism. Other countries followed, including Denmark, Italy, and Poland. In 2005, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution establishing 27 January as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, making Auschwitz's liberation date a global moment of reflection. Major anniversary commemorations draw world leaders, survivors, and their descendants to the site. The 75th anniversary ceremony in January 2020 brought together more than 200 Auschwitz and Holocaust survivors alongside dozens of heads of state and government. It proved to be the last such gathering before the pandemic, and likely the last with so many survivors present. The 80th anniversary in January 2025 marked another milestone, with organisers describing it as the last major commemoration with surviving witnesses in significant numbers. Museum director Piotr Cywinski has emphasised that the authentic memorial is irreplaceable, that nothing can substitute for standing where the crimes occurred. The challenges facing the memorial extend beyond physical preservation and visitor management. Rising anti-Semitism worldwide, the growth of far-right movements, and the proliferation of Holocaust denial on social media have made education more urgent. The museum has developed tools to combat denial, including online resources that allow people to report and counter false claims. Staff monitor social media for misuse of images from the site and respond to those who distort the historical record. The town of Oświęcim itself has grappled with living in the shadow of Auschwitz. The community of approximately 40,000 people has sought to develop its identity beyond the camp, promoting its pre-war Jewish heritage and its cultural attractions. Yet the presence of the memorial shapes everything. Tourism related to Auschwitz drives much of the local economy. Hotels, restaurants, and transportation services cater to the nearly 2 million annual visitors. The balance between commercial development and respect for the sanctity of the site requires constant attention. Educational programming has evolved to address contemporary issues. The Art Museum's International Center for Education designs programs that connect the history of Auschwitz to current challenges, including racism, xenophobia, and the rights of refugees and minorities. Teachers from around the world participate in seminars that explore how to teach about the Holocaust in ways that resonate with young people. The goal is not merely to transmit facts, but to cultivate what museum leaders call moral anxiety, a discomfort with injustice that motivates action. 80 years after liberation, Auschwitz remains a place of pilgrimage and education, of mourning and reflection. The men and women who survived the camp fought for its preservation because they understood that the world needed to remember. The museum that now stands on the site of history's largest murder exists because of their efforts and the support of the international community. It carries forward their testimony to generations who never knew them, a reminder that such crimes happened, that they can happen again, and that vigilance against hatred is the responsibility of all. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Hitler's bunker after WW2. Next, a look at how the Third Reich's final command post was demolished, buried, and debated over for decades. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.